Thanks again for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me, Abby.
Well, you told me it's your first time at the trading floor, and
Absolutely.
indeed, interesting times for the stock markets. You're seeing some interesting moves, especially from Kenya Airways. It's one of the stocks that a number of analysts have mentioned that it's worth watching out for. The share price is now at 16 shillings. And of course, if you remember, 2 years ago, the stock price was at 4 shillings. What does this signal really for the struggling airline?
I think it says good times are ahead. I think KQ has been the poster child for the stock market this week, and you rightly use the word game changer. I think the direct flight to New York, I think that's going to be an absolute game changer. It's connecting us to the largest economy in the world, and New York City being the biggest city in the world. So I think for any investor looking into the Kenyan market, and this is 85% foreign trading investment market. So it means a lot of foreigners took to that very positively. So I think it's going to be an absolutely exciting time ahead.
All right. And looking at really the aviation sector, a number of issues have also emerged when it comes to privatization of Kenya Airways.
Right.
We've seen other Gulf carriers giving Kenya Airways a run for their money, one of them being Ethiopian Airlines and also the Emirates and the Etihads. Do you think KQ, given support, might be able to take on the big boys?
Oh, absolutely. I think KQ has had a long history and it's had a long journey. If you look at where it came from the 90s, I think this is an airline that positioned itself as an African carrier. I think that's always been its value proposition, using Nairobi to be the gateway to the East African market. So I think that's going to be a game changer because Nairobi is so geographically well positioned. So anybody who, for example, was coming from New York in this new flight, you leave New York at 12:30, have lunch in New York, and you have dinner in Nairobi. So think of all the investments that are going to come in. You're right, the Etihads, the Gulf carriers, I mean,
They're heavily subsidized.
And they have huge capitalizations. And I don't even think we should be looking at competing with them. I think we need to look at our competitive advantage. And KQ's competitive advantage is that it's the host airline for the East African gateway, which is Nairobi. So serving almost 5 countries around that. No other airline can take that away from it.
Sure.
So what can it do? It can bring tourists, it can bring business investors. If you talk about horticulture, going to Europe, going to the US. So I think for me, it needs to focus on its competitive advantage and not to look at what the other airlines are doing.
All right. And moving away from aviation, let's go to the power sector. It's been an interesting week. The entire country was under blackout, and I understand it also went even into Uganda. And really, the regulator, the ERC, has been on record saying that the tariffs have been relatively stable. On the flip side, there was this groundbreaking report that Kenya Power has to the tune of about 10.1 billion shillings in accrued costs that were incurred during the time when we were using thermal power. And this was to be passed on to the customers, and we did see the furore this brought about. Really, what way forward for the Kenya Power?
I think this is one of the toughest times for Kenya Power. First of all, they had one of the worst PR gaffes this week with that issue. But even more than that, for the longest time, we've talked about introducing competition in power distribution. If you remember the days of Kenya Post and Telecommunication and how that was disbanded to create a more competitive private sector. And look at how much this telco industry has risen. A lot of people ask, why is it that power distribution has not been treated to the same competitive landscape? Granted, there is a bill in the Senate that has gone through Parliament and is coming through in the energy bill that is going to introduce more competition in power distribution, because I really think at the end of the day is we need to have more competition in that sector. Granted, there's a new leadership coming in. We saw Mr. Mohammed elected at the expense of the former speaker, Kenneth Marende.
Sure.
So it could be new times for Kenya Power, but a lot of people still think that there's some legislative work that needs to be done to introduce more players, to introduce fairer pricing, because the estimate method just isn't doing it for people.
All right. And finally, Ken, looking at the other talking point through the week was, of course, the president named a quarter of his cabinet. And we did see Henry Rotich being retained, CS Treasury, and we also saw Balala in tourism. And in transport, we had James Macharia, as well as his counterpart, Joe Musheru, retaining the ICT docket, and none other than Dr. Fred Matiang'i also being retained. What do you think is in the greater scheme of things that the president might be thinking of? Because he's at a crossing point where he needs to name a legacy cabinet. At the same time, we have the deputy president who also has a stake in this, and he would be interested in a transitional cabinet of sorts.
Right. And more than that, there's a mix of technocrat versus politician. If you remember back in 2013, their view was we need to have a technocrat cabinet, which is professionals who are not going to dabble in politics. If you remember that day they named that cabinet, it was almost like an Obama-esque type of presentation. What we saw last week was a dramatic departure from that. I think they've realized that politics and economics are bedfellows, and you need to have people with a political voice at the highest level of office. So I think we're going to see a lot more politicians coming in. I think we'll still see technocrats. But as you say, there are far more considerations for the presidency now than back in 2013. Obviously, he has the benefit of experience. He has the benefit of better advice. But for me, there'll be so many considerations around gender too. We've not talked about gender, around regional balance. We've always talked about national healing. So for me, I think it's going to be, it might actually take a lot more time than to release the next set, because the first set already generated a lot of conversation. So I think they're going to look at it from every angle. But from an economics perspective, I think it's going to be about investor confidence. Investors always want to see people with capacity, people with experience, people who are decision makers, because at the end of the day, that's what really investors look for. Those are the people who give people that predictability. So I think from that perspective, if you look at the Treasury, obviously Rotich is a Harvard graduate, tremendous experience in the Treasury. And obviously when people see that, and he fairly managed the Eurobond fairly well, I think that kind of confidence that we saw in 2014 with that first Eurobond might be needed in the second Eurobond that they're contemplating raising in later this year.
Sure. Yeah. Many thanks, Ken. Of course, next week we also expect pump prices on the 14th.
Oh, that's going to be a whole different issue, but I think the issue of energy pricing, I think, is something that's going to come under significant scope, because if you look at globally, energy prices are fairly stable.
All right.
So why is it that in Kenya that we should constantly be seeing constant increments? So I think the formula that they're using, I think the public will want to understand the formula they're using a bit more closely. Granted that there are some local dynamics which might not be visible in the global markets, but are played here. But I think that'll be a big, big topic.
All right. Many thanks, Ken Gishinga.
Thank you so much.
Chief Economist at Mentoria Consulting, talking to us on some of the intrigues we've seen throughout the week in the economic sector. And of course, you can only get that dose here on KTN Business Today.